With the current war in the Middle East, there are many narratives and theories as to who lived there first. I say theories because there are no contemporary historical texts except Egyptian tomb and temple hieroglyphics. All other texts are stories, passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation, before being written down hundreds of years later. And we all know how word of mouth stories can change their substance. The main stories relating to the period between 1300 and 1200 BC are to be found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Torah, the Old Testament, and in Homer's novels, the Iliad and the Odyssey. But to find the historical facts, one must read between the lines and form one's own opinion, which is why there are so many different narratives. Nevertheless, with ignoring religious texts, we have tried to find the historical facts. In recent times, however, several scholars have gotten behind the theory which we will relate to, because it looks at different texts that roughly match the timeline, and known geological information that also relates to the timeline. We start in the region known as Mesopotamia, which lies between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. It was amongst the earliest in the world to see agricultural civilization in the early Bronze Age. Spreading west to the Mediterranean coastal area, the independent city-states of Canaan and Egypt were established. Moreover, in the late Bronze Age, Egypt conquered Canaan. Sometime around 1200 BC, the Egyptian religious system of a pantheon of many gods and deities was ended by the Pharaoh Amenhotep IV. He renamed himself Akhenaten and changed the state religion to the first ever monolithic religion of one god, the Aten, banning the worship of graven images and false gods. He moved the capital of Egypt to the newly built city of Anima. However, the old priests, aided by his queen Nefertiti, rose up and overthrew him. They banished him and his followers, demolished Anima, and reinstated Thebes as the capital. This is the only recorded instance of Egyptians being exiled from Egypt, so it has to be the biblical Exodus. But could Akhenaten be the biblical Pharaoh Joseph, or even Moses? After crossing the Nile Delta, they headed east across the Sinai Desert and came to and invaded Canaan. In so doing, they are said to have committed the first ever recorded act of genocide in history, as their one god commanded them to kill every man, woman, and child in Canaan. However, we don't know if this actually happened, as DNA evidence shows us that Israelis still have 5 to 12% Canaan DNA, which means they assimilated with the Canaanites, creating two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The followers of the one god actually crossed the Reed Sea, which is the Nile Delta, not the mistranslated Red Sea. But the tidal wave is the only thing that could cause the so-called parting of the waves. We know from Egyptian records that Akhenaten lived between 1353 to 1336 BC, but scholars are divided on the date of the Minoan eruption, with dates varying from 1600 BC to 1200 BC. So it is that the biblical parting of the waves could well be the 40 to 50 foot tidal wave from the Minoan eruption, which is today called Santorini. It is that eruption that is now generally accepted as the cause of the late Bronze Age collapse, as it was the largest volcanic eruption in human history, and even recorded by the ancient Chinese as it caused a worldwide nuclear winter that lasted for over 3 years, killing crops and animals across the region, changing weather patterns worldwide. The island has a central caldera surrounded by a circular island which housed an advanced civilization. It had paved roads, four-story houses, flushing toilets, and the streets were described as labyrinths. Its influence stretched across the Aegean islands. That included Knossos on the island of Crete, plus the trading hub of Troy on the now northeastern Turkish coasts. But unfortunately, we may never know the true history of the Minoan Empire, as the many examples of Minoan writing have never been successfully translated. It was the survivors of the Santorini eruption, now considered by many historians to be Plato's Atlantis. Shortly after the eruption, the survivors of the Aegean islands, known as the Sea Peoples, started to raid the coastal area south of Judea. After the initial raids, they started to settle the land and build cities. This led to wars with the Israelites, who called them Philistines, and the land they occupied, Philistia. How do we know that the Sea People were the Philistines? Well, Minoan art shows that their warriors wore a unique feathered helmet, which appears in Egyptian and Judean art that refers to the Sea People's invasion. And the early pioneers of Rome and Carthage also feature feathers in their helmets, so they could well have been survivors of the eruption, looking to make a fresh start. By the end of the 8th century BC, the Assyrian Empire conquered the region. This was followed by the Babylonian Empire in 601 BC, then by the Persian Empire in 539 BC. Alexander the Great then conquered the Persian Empire in late 330 BC. In 63 BC, the civil war against the Hasmonean dynasty ended when the Romans conquered the area, and it became part of the Roman Empire as Judea. Roman Judea was troubled by large-scale Jewish revolts, which resulted in Rome sacking Jerusalem and destroying the second Jewish temple. Then, in the 4th century, the Roman Empire, as did the whole of the Middle East, turned Christian, which is a Jewish sect. It was between 631 and 641 AD that the newly created religion of Islam, also a Jewish sect, burst out of Medina and conquered the whole of the Middle East. The Crusades were later ordered by Pope Urban II solely to regain the lost Christian lands, which in 1099 established the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But the Ayyubid Sultanate reconquered it in 1187. There were 9 crusades in total, the last one led by Lord Edward of England in 1271. The Crusades would take a whole video to do them justice, and we may well do one in the future. A succession of Muslim dynasties controlled the area and beat off the Mongol invasion of 1260. The Egyptian Mamluks then reunited the area. In the late 14th century, many European countries started to call the Middle East the Levant. and it was taken up by the Arabs to describe the wider area of Egypt, Israel, and Syria. In 1506, the Ottomans took control of the region and named it Syria, which is how it stayed until the end of the First World War in 1918. During that war, the British captured the Middle East from the Ottomans. They then issued the Balfour Declaration, favouring the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. The League of Nations gave Britain mandatory power over the area, calling it Palestine in 1922. British colonial rule and Arab efforts to prevent Jewish migration into Palestine led to growing sectarian violence between the Arabs and the Jews, eventually causing the British government to announce its intention to terminate the mandate in 1947. The United Nations General Assembly recommended partitioning Palestine into two states, one Arab, one Jewish. But the Arabs rejected the partition plan. The Jews, however, accepted the plan, declaring independence of the State of Israel in May 1948 upon the termination of the British mandate. However, the situation in Palestine had deteriorated into a civil war between Arabs and Jews. Then, nearby Arab countries then invaded Palestine, but Israel not only prevailed, but also conquered far more territory of the mandate than envisioned by the partition plan. During the war, 700,000, or about 80% of all Palestinians, fled or were driven out of the territory that Israel had conquered and were not allowed to return. This was in an effort to prevent another war. This became known as the Makba, the catastrophe to the Arabs. Starting in the late 1940s and continuing for decades thereafter, about 850,000 Jews from across the world emigrated, made aliyah to Israel. After the war, only two parts of Palestine remained in Arab control, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Despite international objections, Israel started to establish settlements in those legitimate war gains, but the Arabs called them occupied territories. And this was the start of the troubles that are still resulting in conflict to the present day.